Hello and welcome to Taiwan Today. I am Natalie Tso. Taiwan will elect its next president in January. Now, how have the mass protests in Hong Kong affected Taiwan and its presidential election campaigns? Well, today I have with me a political analyst, Courtney Donovan Smith. He hosts Current Affairs Taiwan, is also the founder of Taiwan Daily News in English on Facebook. Well, Donovan, it's great to have you here.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, and the world knows that there have been massive protests against China, basically, or an extradition bill in Hong Kong. And all of us in Taiwan are feeling, the tension as well.
Oh, yeah.
So how would you say this has affected Taiwan politically?
Well, I think it brought back the sovereignty question. Very importantly, I think a lot of analysts and a lot of voters thought that after the last local elections, particularly the international media, you saw this a lot there. It was a big win for China, and expect Taiwan to move much closer to China and all of that. Whereas I think that most local analysts here in Taiwan would view the local elections last November as more of a referendum on local issues and local politics. So this was a very strong reminder that coming into this election cycle, where we're talking about the presidential election and the legislative election, the big issues are not your local economy issues, your local marriage equality issues. It's the national sovereignty issue and China right across the strait with the missiles pointed at us. And of course, the one country, two systems is that's in Hong Kong was originally envisaged by China to use for Taiwan. So this has been very, very much on people's minds, I think, here in Taiwan. And of course, there's been a lot of people saying, both in Hong Kong and here, there's been a lot of people saying, now Hong Kong, next Taiwan. And so I think it was a big reminder, and very, very importantly for Tsai, at the time that it happened, and this is kind of important, it happened right while the presidential primary for the ruling DPP was taking place. Now, this primary was a public opinion poll, unlike in most countries, of course, where you have usually it's party members. This is a public opinion poll pitting the two major candidates against local politicians in a theoretical presidential runoff or presidential election. And as my co-host on Current Affairs Taiwan noted, he said, imagine you get a pollster calling you during the primary, and you have Hong Kong and the riots or the protests going on the TV. And I think that was a very important point.
So that would make people more wary of China. But why would it help Taiwan more than William Lai?
Now, that's a great question. I think that in this case, in the DPP primary, I think this was a strong reminder that Tsai is a safe pair of hands. I think that people realize that her background is as a diplomat. She's steered the ship fairly well so far. Her opinions actually align very closely with the opinions of the mainstream public opinion here in Taiwan. And so I think that that's why a lot of people felt more secure with her, whereas her opponent was associated with the independence movement and a more radical approach, according to, I guess you'd say, the mainstream opinion.
So Hong Kong definitely helped Taiwan get her presidential candidacy?
Yeah.
You think so?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Also, they did a different type of poll. They did half the polls via mobile phone and half during landline. What would you say the big difference of that effect would have?
Well, there was quite a bit of a negotiation between the two parties on this one. William Lai, or Lai Ching-te, the ex-premier who was challenging Tsai, he and his camp wanted to do it entirely off of landlines because his core support demographic skewed older and was more likely to be at home and also around a landline, whereas inside the party, Tsai Ing-wen's support base tends to be skew a little bit younger and she tends to do quite well with younger voters.
So some people have said the polls are not fair.
Everybody's going to say the polls are not fair all the time.
What do you think of Taiwan's method of choosing their presidential candidates this year, especially? The KMT is doing this as well. You know, the DPP choosing solely by polls. It's quite a unique way of choosing a presidential candidate for the party. What do you think of this method?
It's tricky and it's risky. The problem, like, okay, for example, in this election cycle, Tsai Ing-wen, she had not really started to campaign. She was not prepared for a primary challenger, because traditionally people here didn't challenge
It's
an
quite
incumbent.
rare,
Yeah,
actually.
at any political level.
Right.
You know, the mayoral level, it's very
And in other
unusual.
countries as well, right?
Exactly,
Same thing.
yeah. And so there was this sudden primary challenge, which meant that she was not prepared for it. So she and the top brass kind of played with the rules a little bit here to get a delay, so that so that she had time to campaign, carry out her message more. So that's one possible disadvantage. The other is that what the opinion polls say today and what they're going to say on election day is a very different thing. Quite a lot can happen. At this point, for example, in the last election cycle with the local elections, now one of the top presidential candidates, Han Kuo-yu, Daniel Han from Kaohsiung, nobody thought that he could possibly win. So he would have done terribly in the polls. So that's another potential problem. And a final problem I could say, or I guess there's more, but is that party members tend to be the ones who donate money and tend to be active on the ground. So their support is not being well gauged by this method. Before, they used to have a partial, and the KMT originally this year was supposed to have a partial public opinion.
30% for party members and 70% for public.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. And that, I think, would have given a better idea of a bit of both.
So it's interesting that things have changed for both parties, right?
Yeah.
And we also saw a mass anti-Chinese influence on the media protest this past Sunday. Was this because of Hong Kong? What do you think is going on in Taiwan's public now?
I think that was a big influence. I think that really helped concentrate the mind. I think you're right on that. I think another thing is that in the last election cycle and through the first part of this election cycle, there's been a very, very heavy and open bias by some of the media, which has very, very strong and open, they're unabashed about it, ties in China. And they are very, very clear that they are promoting the long-term unification of Taiwan and China, and that's their agenda. And so they have that candidate I just mentioned, Daniel Han Kuo-yu, of course. He in one case, one channel, TV channel, a news channel, gave 60%, I believe it was, of all their coverage to just this one candidate. That's all their news coverage. So
does it make it obvious that China likes this candidate?
Yeah.
I mean, if they're connected to China, right? Then
yeah. Well, here's something interesting, is that there's also a lot of chatter going on, but that because there's two major groups that have considerable business ties with China. And apparently some of their editorial decisions and staffing decisions are approved in China. But they seem to be supporting two different candidates in the KMT. So it may not be quite so simple.
So clear, right?
Yeah. In other words, there may be different people in China, and who prefer different candidates. But it's very clear they prefer the KMT candidates.
So what do you think about this Chinese influence over Taiwan's media? Is that going to affect society a lot? Is that going to affect our freedom of speech? I mean, what do you think about how China's working here?
I think in some ways, it's just simply obvious. if you're watching the channel that, for example, covered a Hanguoyu 60% of the time, you're pretty clear where that bias is coming from. And that's, in a sense, I feel that that's a little bit less insidious in the sense that the market chooses to a certain degree, whether you want to watch it or not. Something that actually a Deutsche Welle's journalist just recently posted online, which is very insightful about how it can be a lot more subtle and tricky, is William Young pointed out that there's a lot of radio stations, for example, in central and southern Taiwan, which is traditionally much more localist oriented politically in terms of sovereignty. And there are a lot of radio shows that generally, particularly older men, listen to. And so they're very, very popular. They're generally not political shows, but there's money and influence coming in from China, so they'll offhand occasionally bring in a few political topics and make a few mentions. And there's been a sharp uptick in support recently among pan-blue or KMT candidates among this demographic. Something that I noticed is that there was a jump on it was Twitter users for Hanguoyu in the last election cycle of, it was about 1/3 or 1/4 in a single day, and that's coming from somewhere, and that was used as a way of demonstrating that he is more popular than other politicians because he's got more followers.
I'm sure China can get a lot of people to follow somebody,
yes,
if they wanted to.
Yeah, they weren't very subtle about it, but yeah. So that's kind of how it works. Is often it's the more subtle ways that's a little bit more concerning, I think.
But what do you think about Mayor Cohen's? I mean, he's been on the polls. He hasn't even announced that he's going to run yet.
Yeah.
But he's a part of these polls. What do you think his chances are of winning?
Of winning or entering the
race? Entering and winning, yeah.
He said something very interesting down in my neck of the woods at the Dajia Matsu pilgrimage. And he said that he'd already made up his mind, but he was trying to convince himself out of it. Now, he didn't say whether he'd made up his mind one way or the other. But if you follow his comments, he says things like, I'm waiting to see if the KMT and DPP candidates can do a good job. He's showing up at events and activities around the island. It's looking like I think, this is my take, is that he actually has convinced himself that he is going to run. Or he's decided that the plan is to run, but he's trying to convince himself that that's definitely the right choice. In terms of the KMT candidate and the DPP candidate, he has openly disparaged Tsai Ing-wen of the DPP multiple times, and I'm not getting the sense that he thinks at least Han Kuo-yu or the other KMT candidates are going to impress him that much.
So he thinks he's the guy for the job.
I think he thinks he is.
Okay.
But he's giving himself time to wait and see what happens.
And I did hear you say on your own show that you think President Tsai has a very good chance of winning.
Yeah, I've thought this for a while. And the reason I think this is that, and I actually was just online talking with my co-host on that, is that if you look, the most recent polls actually have President Tsai doing very, very well, in the sense that she's got double-digit leads against her two main theoretical opponents, which would be either Han Kuo-yu or Terry Go or Guo Taiming from the KMT, or Eric Chu and Ko Wen-ze, Ke-pi of Taipei. But in a sense, those are actually bad numbers. And the reason I say this is that if you look at her opinion on sovereignty issues, Taiwan's role in the world, she's very much tracked to main popular opinion on this. What's the mainstream opinion on this? The KMT candidates are doing far better in the polls than their opinion is if you look at their opinion on sovereignty, they're doing far better than than they would if the public were voting entirely on that issue. Cohen's he's an independent, so he's kind of an interesting variable. But she's leading, and right now, with these three candidates, she's the one I think that most people will consider will keep the country safe in the way that they hope or see the development of Taiwan in relations with the United States and China.
Okay, so we'll have to see, though.
Oh, yes. Now, there's some big variables, too.
Definitely.
For example, if the NPP throws in a candidate.
Oh, that would be interesting, too. It would take some support from probably the
considerably
party, right?
younger voters, yeah.
All right. So, I've been speaking with political analyst Courtney Donovan Smith about Taiwan's presidential election campaigns. He is one of the hosts of Current Affairs Taiwan, and also the founder of Taiwan Daily News in English. Next week, we'll talk about the KMT primaries. Thanks for joining me on Taiwan Today. I'm Natalie Tso.